spooky stories to listen to in the dark.
This is Tale of Two Dead Girls, and we are your ghostesses. I'm Kayla.
And I'm Kale.
Cozy up, turn off the lights, and get ready to be spooked shitless.
Hello, trick-or-treaters. I'm Kayla, and today I'm going to be sharing 2 stories from yourghoststories.com. This one is called Suffocated by Evil by Rebecca. I was asleep one night when I awoke, realizing that I couldn't breathe. Now, I have several cats, and on occasion, they will lie down on my face while sleeping, such is their way, so I assumed this was what was happening. However, when I was fully awake, I realized that I couldn't move, and furthermore, that it was my pillow that was covering my face. I was lying on my side, and the pillow I had on my head was folded up over my face. So, once again, I assumed a cat had just slipped under there, but that wasn't it. I started to panic because I couldn't move, and I also couldn't breathe. Now, the pillow just wasn't covering my face, it was being pressed into my face. I finally was able to, using all my might, move my head just a little bit back and forth. After a couple seconds of that, the pillow suddenly dropped from my face, and standing right next to my bed was this tall, thin, death figure, except all in white, like a skeleton in a long, heavy, hooded robe that covered all but the hands. Where the face would be was just ethereal whiteness. Within a split second, this figure reached down and grabbed my bedspread and pulled it over my face and held it tight, trying to suffocate me again. I thought, this thing is going to kill me. I have to do something. But again, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. Then I remembered that I had been studying up on auras, and I had realized this was my only chance. Again, with all my might, I envisioned an energy field around me, and when it solidified, I pushed it as hard as I could towards this thing by my bed. Suddenly, the bedspread flew off my face and nearly off the bed, and I was able to see this thing being flung back to wherever it came from. It just quickly flew back away from the bed, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared. When it was gone, I was suddenly able to move again, so I immediately jumped out of bed and flung on all the lights and started screaming and crying, still being frightened out of my mind. I couldn't stop screaming and crying about it for 2 days. I had truly felt like someone had tried to just kill me. I couldn't go to work. I couldn't do anything. It took about a week for me to be able to get back into my bedroom, and then about a month for me to be able to go to sleep without having all the lights on. People who know this event ask me how I could still live there. I tell them, if something evil is out to get you, it will find you wherever you are. Moving won't change that. This happened in April of 2003. This one is called Southern Gothic by Kurt Rowlett. In 1987, I was living in a house in Atlanta with 4 roommates. We lived there for just over a year, and during that time, we had several experiences with what we later became convinced was an actual ghostly presence. The house we were renting was well over 100 years old, having been built sometime just after the American Civil War, when Atlanta had been burned and destroyed by Union forces. The house was a beautiful old Victorian home located in an area of Atlanta known as Inman Park. We were all pretty young, in our 20s, and trying to get started in our respective careers, so the prospect of sharing the rent for a wonderful old 2-story, 5-bedroom house with a full basement was an attractive one. 1 week after moving in, we were all asleep in our rooms when we were awakened by screaming from our roommate, whom I'll call Hannah. We all jumped out of bed and went into Hannah's room. She was sitting up and saying that she had woken up to see the dark figure of a man standing next to her bed, looking down at her. She said that when she had screamed, the figure turned and walked out of the room. She was very scared and highly agitated. Myself and the other male roommates, the housemates, consisted of 2 male-female couples and 1 single female, immediately checked out the inside and outside of the house, but we couldn't find an intruder. This happened around 2 or 3 in the morning. We finally got Hannah to calm down and everyone went back to bed. The next day, we just chalked up this first incident to nervousness about living in a new home that just happened to be a creaky and somewhat spooky old antique house. However, Hannah would not hear of that explanation. She refused to stay in the house alone after that. About 2 weeks after that first incident, we were again all asleep when suddenly there was a loud crash and the sound of tinkling of glass from the hallway that separated all of the bedrooms and a common bathroom. Once more, we all jumped up and ran out of the hall, where we found that a full-length mirror that had been mounted onto the bathroom door had shattered into hundreds of pieces all over the floor. Since everyone had been asleep, we could not figure out how this happened, as the mirror frame was still securely intact to the door and only the glass itself had broken. Atlanta is not prone to earthquakes and the street was not a busy one, so we ruled out the possibility that a large truck or something had passed by and caused vibrations to occur inside the place. Later, similar poltergeist activity would manifest itself in many other ways. There was one instance when I was home alone in the house watching television when, for no good reason that I could later ascertain, 3 candles that were sitting on the fireplace mantel suddenly fell off onto the floor, almost as if someone had swept them off with a hand. Then there was the phenomenon that we all experienced at one time or another, where personal objects and other items would go missing, only to turn up later in a place where the owner would swear that he or she had not left them. On one occasion, missing car keys were found lying right in the middle of a person's bed after a thorough search had been conducted for them by everyone home at the time. Other strange activity came in the form of knocking and tapping sounds heard coming from either the attic or the basement when it was certain that no one was in either space. The last incident that involved the sighting of an actual entity occurred about 2 months after we had moved in. We were having a small party at our place, and a house guest, who none of us had met prior to the party, was taking a personal tour of the place on her own. She suddenly came running up from downstairs saying that she had just seen a man standing in the corner of the basement. She said that when she had called out to him, he simply disappeared. We immediately went down to the basement to check, and of course, nobody was there. This was most interesting because there was only one entrance into the basement, and a person who might have been trying to play a trick would not have been able to escape past anyone without being seen. As noted, that house guest who saw the figure in the basement was a brand new acquaintance whom we later determined had no prior knowledge that our place had any sort of unusual activity connected to it. After about 6 months of all of this, things seemed to quiet down and no more ghost activity was noticed or reported by anyone. We began to convince ourselves that maybe, just maybe, we had all overreacted to some degree and perhaps we were all just being overly imaginative about the whole thing. Finally, toward the end of our time living in the house, my wife and I were out at a restaurant one evening having a drink and dinner. We struck up a conversation with one another, sitting at a table nearby, 2 people who were completely strangers to us and whom we happened to meet that night by total chance. When they asked us where we were living in Atlanta, we told them about our place in Inman Park. They said, "Really? We used to live in Inman Park. What street do you live on?" When we told them, they said, "That is interesting. We used to rent a house on the same street. What is your address?" When we gave our address to them, they said, "Oh my God. We used to rent that exact same house ourselves," immediately followed by the woman saying, "Have you seen the ghost yet?" Well, you can imagine that both my wife and I were completely flabbergasted to have received such a validation about our ghost problem from 2 complete strangers. We ended up comparing notes with them, and they told us about many strange happenings they had witnessed in the house that were quite similar to our own. That experience thoroughly convinced me that there really is something to the whole subject of ghosts, and afterward, I no longer dismissed similar stories that I heard from other people quite so easily.
Ghostly greetings. My name is Kale, and today I'm also going to be sharing a story from yourghoststories.com. This one is titled The Lady in Black at the End of My Bed by Plume. For years, I've tried to explain this event. At the time, it couldn't have seemed more real. It was 2007. I was living in a townhouse in Newcastle, not far from a steep cliff by the sea, which has been known to claim a number of people's lives over the years. I went to bed at around 11 p.m. and I was woken up after 30 minutes when I heard some distant noises in my bedroom that I still remember vividly to this day. I could clearly hear footsteps on the carpet walking around my room close to my bed, and occasionally noises that sounded like clothes dropping on my floor a number of times. It was as if someone was picking up shirts off of my bedroom floor and dropping them back down onto the carpet. I was awake during numerous noises I heard in what seemed like a period of 2 minutes. At the time, the most I reacted to this was slightly opening my eyes for a moment. I was not alarmed. Even though I was certain that somebody was in my room, I had reasoned with myself in a sleepy state that my flatmate may have just came in briefly to look around for something. With this in mind, I thought nothing of it and casually went back to sleep, even though that in itself would have been very unusual behavior from him. Not long after I went back to sleep, I awoke again to the same noises. There were more footsteps on the carpet walking around my bed and the sound of clothes being dropped on the floor again. Then I heard a louder noise which suddenly raised my awareness. There was a small plastic wrapper on the floor at the end of my bed which I had previously not noticed. It was likely a thin, transparent seal from a cigarette packet, and I heard the crunching noise of someone standing on it. In an otherwise silent room, the noise was quite loud. My eyes suddenly opened wide. I was now wide awake and quickly rethought the situation. Someone was in my room. I was certain of that. Then it suddenly dawned on me. There was no way my flatmate or anyone else I know would be walking around my room in the dark while I was sleeping. I had a rush of adrenaline and my heart started pounding out of control. I felt paralyzed with fear, but I had to confront who was there. After a moment of hesitation, I sat up very fast and faced towards the end of my bed where the sound came from, quickly enough to startle anyone who would have been there. Then I saw a lady with long blonde gray hair who appeared to be in her late 50s. She was standing sideways near the end of the bed wearing a black dress. I could see her silhouette against the white wall behind her, and there was enough moonlight illuminating the room to make out her facial features. I stared directly at her eyes for a few seconds and was thoroughly haunted by her expressionless face staring right back at me over her left shoulder. She had frozen still where she stood on the plastic wrapper. After a few moments, I said, "Hey," with a sense of fear, struggling a bit to get the word out. She continued to stare at me, blank-faced and wide-eyed, without flinching, which made my skin crawl by the second. I was terrified. The second time I shouted, "Hey!" and almost immediately leapt out of my bed to try to grab her. I was overwhelmed with fear, and the fight or flight response kicked in. Except I had nowhere to run. In the process of rapidly hurling myself out of bed towards her, I must have closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, because my arms went right through where she was standing just a moment before. She had vanished. I turned on the bedroom light and stood with my back against the wall for a good 10 minutes, trying to comprehend what I just experienced. The following night, one of the flatmates reported seeing an unexplained person in the dark walking past the bathroom door behind him in the mirror while he was shaving. And this was before he knew about my experience from the night before. On the third night, at the very moment I was told in person of his experience in the same house and made the connection of the two events, the bathroom door immediately slammed shut upstairs. This is where the second separate sighting had taken place the night before. At the time, there was no one upstairs, it was pitch black, and it couldn't have been the wind that slammed the door. I can add one more thing. My flatmate, who saw the ghost on the second night, apparently had seen a particular ghost before as a child on a regular basis. Bear in mind that he saw something in the same part of the house the night after my experience, before he even knew of my experience. When he reported that he saw a dark figure go past the door in the mirror while he was shaving, he was then told of my experience and replied, "Oh no, not again." He went on to explain to me that as a child he would sleep in his father's room and they would regularly have a ghost visitor, an old lady from what I can recall, and she would stand at the end of their bed. He mentioned that she made regular appearances so often that they gave her a name. As far as I know, this occurred until his father passed away a few years later. I've heard a few accounts of ghosts standing at the end of people's beds over the years or even sitting at the end of their bed. It seems like a common location for these visitations, or whatever you might call them. To reiterate, there were 2 individual sightings of a figure in black 2 nights in a row in the same part of the house, and neither of us knew of each other's experiences until later. The very moment this connection was made and we spoke it out loud in the house, on the 3rd night, the bathroom door violently slammed shut upstairs in the dark and there was no one up there. The door that slammed shut was the bathroom where my flatmates saw the dark figure walk past the door in the mirror, which was only a few steps away from my room.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Spooky Stories to Listen to in the Dark. We'll scare you later.